There are many unsettling things about being in or working in a morgue, and here are 8 stories to help creep you out even more. Enjoy. My brother is a mortician at a facility in New York, and one night when I was visiting, he asked if I wanted to go to work with him so I wouldn't be alone in his house. Reluctantly, I said yes. What's the worst that could happen, right? Boy, was I wrong. To start off with, this place was creepy as hell. Dark, and smelled funny. He said it was normal, and it was probably the smell of the formaldehyde, so I just ignored it. After a little time off chit-chatting and catching up, he told me he needed to get to work, but that I could stay in the little adjoined office and watch some TV, so I did. The entrance to the morgue had swinging doors that you could hear when someone was coming in or out of. He came in to check on me a few times, so I heard the noise. After a few hours of being by myself, I started to doze off when the sudden sound of the doors woke me up. Expecting for my brother to walk in and greet me, there was nothing. Again, I started to fall asleep, and yet again, the loud doors sound went off. You couldn't tell if someone was coming in or out, but they kept on swinging and did not stop. Thinking my brother was playing a joke on me, I got up and went to tell him to stop. But to my surprise, there was only a little girl standing there, playing with the doors, pushing them. "Hi," I told her. She looked at me and didn't say a word. One of the things that caught my eye was a pretty blue dress with a big pink ribbon she was wearing. "Your dress is pretty, and the bow makes it stand out." Again, nothing. She looked down and started to run the opposite way, toward a lonesome hall. I thought the kid belonged to another employee, so I went back to my chair. Hours later, when my brother's shift was over, he finally woke me up to go back to his place. As we were driving, I started to tell him about the doors and the little girl with a cute blue dress and a big pink ribbon. He slammed on the brakes. "What the hell? Why did you brake?" "Tessa," he told me with a chilling look in his eyes. "I just did an autopsy on a little girl that drowned. She was wearing a blue dress with a big pink ribbon." My blood ran cold, and I've never been to work with my brother ever again. At night, it can be a little creepy when you have to go to the morgue. One night, myself and a coworker were taking someone down to the morgue. Now, let me explain. Our morgue is a little freezer box that is in the basement and smells horrible. Plus, it has a ramp to get into it. So she and I wheel the body down there and we push it up the ramp, and then we argue over who is going to push the body in. Of course, I lose, so I swing the freezer door open, push in the body, and slam the door shut. We start to fill out our paperwork when we both look up at each other, and she says to me, "Did you hear that?" I said, "I think so." We both turn and look directly at the door and got cold chills as the hair on our arms were standing straight up. It sounded like someone was crying out for help from inside the freezer. We both looked at each other and with tremendous fear ran out. Days later, I was telling one of my friends, who was also a nurse on our floor, about the story. She tells me that she has had similar things happen to her in the morgue as well. To this day, I will not go alone, and I try to get out of there as fast as I can.
I used to work in a tissue recovery. My least favorite part was prepping the donor for the recovery process, as it included shaving the arms and legs. Once we had a donor who was very freshly deceased. I held his hand to shave his arm, and his fingers curled around my hand as rigor mortis set in.
My experience was when I first started my embalming career. I had just started my shift and was using a restroom in the back. When I came out, I heard what sounded like a girl sobbing and the sound of feet shuffling around on the floor. The floor was gravelly and had a distinct sound if you scooted your feet on it. The sound was coming from around a corner that led into a small room where we would store embalmed bodies ready to be delivered to their respective funeral homes. I figured someone was upset and crying, so I snuck in, still hearing the sobbing. When I peeked around the corner, the room was empty. No living person in there. I noticed that there was only one body in there as well. A young girl. She shot herself on the side of the head. I wasn't scared per se, but I'm certain you could audibly hear my heart beat. When I get to work, that's all it is to me. Just a job. I've never really had any feelings for the people I've worked on, since that's what I'm there to do, and of course, I don't know them. But this particular day had been embedded in my head ever since. I had done countless autopsies before without a problem, but came the day I was dreading. An autopsy on a child. It was a child no older than a year or so. It was really hard, since I have a child myself. As I worked on him, and I was getting ready to wrap things up, I turned around, and standing right there was a woman, sobbing. I assumed it was the mother, and I told her she couldn't be in there. I asked her how she got in, but no response. She left the room, and a few minutes later, another body came on the stretcher. It was the woman I had just seen. I guess she just wanted to make sure the baby was okay. To this day, no one believes me, but I know what I saw. One of the hardest things I have to do in my line of duty is letting the family members in to identify the bodies. One particular day, I had to let some parents in to identify their son who had passed in a car crash. Their daughter waited outside. The lady could not handle the pain of seeing her son that way, so she broke out, and I told her daughter to take her to the restroom. Not even 5 minutes later, they both came back to tell me that they heard the young man's voice while they were in the stalls. I didn't really know what to say, but I reassured them that he had indeed passed. A few days after the incident, I stayed in my office past midnight when the lights started to flicker. Ignoring this, I kept working when I heard a loud, "Help me!" coming from inside one of the freezers. The same freezer where I had put the young man a few days ago. "Help me!" I heard again. "I'm Jacob," the voice said. As astonished as I was to hear this, and yes, the man's name was indeed Jacob, I froze in my tracks and decided to open the door. As I suspected, nothing was there but an empty slab. Blaming this on my lack of sleep, I went back to work, and nothing happened until the following night. I went to the men's room, which is across the hall from the morgue, and while I was doing my business, a loud shriek came from the room, and yet again, "Help me! I'm Jacob!" I came out as fast as I could, and nothing was there. To this day, I wondered what would have happened if I would have asked Jacob what he needed help with.
I was headed home after a long night at work. I was exhausted. It had been a pretty heavy day. I don't know how I managed to get home, but I did. I had worked on a young woman that night. She had caught my attention since she had these beautiful green eyes. That night at my apartment, I kept having dreams about that woman. I don't know why. I kept seeing her running from something or someone, but I couldn't see who it was. After a while of running after her, I finally caught up to her, and I asked what she was running from. She told me, "I'm running from my boyfriend. He wants to kill me." And the last thing I remember was seeing those big green eyes fade away in front of me. When I awoke the next day, the same woman was on my TV screen. They were looking for her boyfriend in connection with her murder. I never really told anyone about my experience, but I will never forget those beautiful green eyes.
At times, your imagination goes wild, especially if this is your first year working at a morgue, and here is my experience. Sure, just like any other person, I enjoy horror movies, but I never thought of them as being real, especially when it comes to the supernatural. There had been a big accident somewhere nearby. I live in a small town, and it was the 3rd month that I had been working there. So being one of the newbies, I had to show I was able to do this. The accident was a pile-up, and there were several bodies at once in the morgue. Since some of them came in as pieces, we had to put them back together like a puzzle. I don't want to get too morbid, so I'll skip ahead. After a while of trying to figure things out, some of the other guys decided to go on a break. I decided to stay since I really didn't know them. I kept working, and I actually thought I saw a forearm with a tattoo move a little bit. I thought to myself that it was just my imagination, so I kept working. Next thing I know, I saw it move again. I decided to hell with it and kept looking at it, but nothing happened. I actually felt silly. I saw it move for a 3rd time, and this time, it really did move. Right there in front of my eyes. But how can this be possible? My coworkers busted through the doors, and I didn't say anything. Sometime later, one of them approached me and told me, Hey man, you got it wrong. I got what wrong? That piece. That arm. It doesn't belong to that body. What? See, this forearm goes over there. It belongs to that body. I had actually made the mistake of misplacing the parts. And I guess, I know it's silly to say this, but maybe the arm was trying to tell me something. Sometimes your life can take an unexpected turn in the blink of an eye, and for these people, it did exactly that. The following stories are from people recounting their scariest memories and moments that have happened to them. Enjoy. I was home for the summer from college, and my mother and brother had just headed out for a few-day trip to visit colleges. This meant I was to take care of my father. Something was clearly wrong, but we couldn't tell what. He had Parkinson's, but it was more than that. But we figured I could handle it. This is when I came to realize something in his broken mind hated me with a passion. He wouldn't listen to anything I said. Now, I admit, I was pissed off, so I wasn't doing a terrific job, but even simple things like getting him food was an hour-long ordeal that ended with us shouting. This last time, I called Mom on the house phone because at least he'd listen to her. I gave him one phone and I was on the other, yelling at each other through it, even though we were 5 feet apart. Poor Mom, trying to referee from a few hundred miles away. Finally, Dad hangs up his phone and hands it to me. Oh, he's done, thank God, I think. But then he tries to take the still active phone from my hand, which I refuse. And that's when it happens. A change came over him. It was subtle, but he stood slightly straighter. It was like for a moment, someone else was in his body. He stared at me, and in the most calm, cold voice I have ever heard, "I'm going to kill you." There was no emotion behind it, no energy. He just said it as a fact. I was stunned. Mom heard it over the phone as I stood there, paralyzed. Her voice broke through in a whisper. "Kai, run!" I threw the phone at my dad, rounded the corner, and grabbed my keys. My car screamed out of the driveway. It was pure animal instinct for me at that point. I had to run, because if I had stayed there... Dad didn't really remember what happened. He was confused as to why I was suddenly gone. I have no idea what went on in his head at that moment, but I stared into something back there. I was working at a crematory/funeral home, and I just picked up the body of a girl my age from the county coroner's office and was going through the check-in procedure. This consisted of lots of paperwork, fingerprints, documentation of belongings, etc. Now, when a body comes to us from the coroner, it's typically an unexpected death that occurred under questionable circumstances. This particular one, I could tell simply by looking at her, was a drug overdose. She had very obvious injection sites in her arms, thigh, one on her foot, and what appeared to be needle marks all over her lower abdomen. Like, it looked like this chick went to fucking town, stabbing herself in the belly. This was strange to me, because I know it isn't a typical place to inject drugs. Especially because this girl was a bit on the heavy side. Nor is it usually a place where the pathologist will draw fluids in a case like this. Anyway, I shrugged it off and began to document her personal items, which come to us zipped up in the body bag in a black trash bag. Usually, the coroner's office provides a detailed list of belongings for liability reasons. This case came with no such list, so it surprised me to see that she did indeed have a property bag with her, tucked under a leg. I tore the bag open, and out flopped a fully developed, completely green, dead baby with a very smushed head. You can imagine my shock, opening the bag, expecting to find shoes, clothes, maybe a wallet, and instead a tiny human plopping out. Long story short, the family did not know, and telling them was horrifying in and of itself. There was absolutely no sort of documentation on this fully developed human, and the coroner was just as shocked as we were. Some jackass autopsy tech had just stuffed the baby in a bag in hopes of us not finding it and cremating it to save themselves some time on paperwork and dealing with an already distraught family. An autopsy was done on the baby. Family and friends were questioned, the whole 9 yards. Later, a friend of the deceased disclosed that she was the only one who the girl had told about being pregnant, and her plans to try and give herself a late-stage abortion by injecting heroin straight into her womb. Pretty fucked up. Needless to say, I was always hesitant when opening property bags in fear of finding another dead, green infant as opposed to a pair of Nikes. When my friend's dad was around 17, he decided to go camping with about 8 or so of his friends. This took place in the Wisconsin forest. When they got to the site, they decided to split up to collect firewood in groups of 2 and meet back at the site in around 20 minutes. One group wasn't back right away, and since they were a couple, they just assumed they were fornicating in some bushes and cracked a couple jokes about it. After around an hour, they decided they should probably go look for them and headed off to search in the area they had been collecting wood. They saw, behind a bush, part of the girl's bloody shirt, and the man's shoes were lying scattered around the scene. They quickly rushed back to their car so they could drive to the park ranger's office, which was about 5 miles away, so they could report the incident. However, they found that their gas had been siphoned, so they had no choice but to walk. On their walk back to the office, they saw a semi pass by with one driver and 2 faces pressed up against the window, which they believe were their friends begging for help. The 2 friends were reported missing and have never been found to this day. This happened senior year of high school. My best friend and I were at her house, which was way up in one of the canyons, and she had a long, windy driveway. We had been there all day, and her mom had gone out. She and I were supposed to go meet a couple friends in Hollywood that night. Anyway, we had been goofing around all day and watching scary movies and whatnot. Started to get ready to go out. Her bathroom had one of those his-her double sink deals, so she was near one. I was at the other. All of a sudden, I got the creepiest feeling. All of the hair on my arms stood up, and I had this sudden feeling of panic. To this day, it is the most terrified I have ever been. I was putting on eyeliner when it happened, and I caught her eye in the mirror and said, "We need to leave. Right now." I thought she would be like, "What? You're being ridiculous." But instead she said, "I know." My blood ran cold when she said it. We left so quickly that we just grabbed what was in front of us. We booked it out of her house and down the driveway, which we weren't supposed to do because her mother had just had it repaved and her car was parked down on the street. We rounded the curve in the driveway, and there was an SUV parked dead center in the middle of the street without its lights on. Suddenly, the lights turned on full blast, and the SUV blared its horn and took off. We scrambled the rest of the way down, totally ruining the new pavement. We were getting into her car and calling the police when her mom pulled up right behind us. To this day, I do not know if it was a robber, but the fact that she and I both got the same sense of dread at the exact same time creeps me out to no end. Quite a few years ago now, my mom went on a vacation with a friend of hers to Florida for a week and a half during the winter. So I was alone at home and took advantage of it by setting up my consoles on the big living room TV. One night it was snowing, and throughout the night I felt really uncomfortable. Granted, this was day 6 of 11, and I've never actually been alone in the house for that long before, so I just chalked it up to loneliness. The snow stopped sometime in the middle of the night. I went to sleep on the couch around 2 a.m. Next morning, plows came down the street and cleared them up as usual. I had left to pick up some stuff at the store down the street, but I stopped almost immediately when I got off the porch. There were footprints in the snow leading up to the large bay window on the side of the house, a set leading toward and away. The ones leading in were slightly filled from the snowfall. Then there were 2 footprints positioned right next to the far corner of the window, close to the rear porch, and some large bushes that were finely detailed and pointed toe toward the wall. Someone had been standing outside the window for a while, staring into my house, and didn't leave until the snow stopped. The tracks started and ended at the street, so where they came from and where they went afterwards were destroyed by the plows. I have since bought large tinted sheets to cover said window, hung thick, dark curtains, and rearranged furniture to cover the entire bottom third of the entire window length. Fuck that shit ever again. I'm a 31-year-old man, and the idea of someone just staring into my house through the windows gives me the kind of anxious horror I felt when I almost fell off a 15-foot cliff. I can't even sit by windows at night without fully closing curtains. This one is sort of a 2-in-1 bonus. The first part is mine. The next part is my mother's. Mine was looking into my rapist's eyes right before he attacked me. He had been a friend of mine before that, and I thought I knew him well. But in that moment, he just looked so eerily inhuman. His expression was this weird mix of completely blank and kind of manic. You know, in Jaws, there's a line about how the shark had doll's eyes. That's what it looked like, if that makes any sense. I can't describe how unnerving it is to look at someone and just know they intend to do you imminent harm. My mother's story is when she was probably 16. She was babysitting for one of her neighbors after dark one night in a quiet, suburban residential area in a small town. She heard a knock on the door, which came as a surprise because she hadn't expected the parents to be home that early. So she called out, "Who is it?" and got no response, but another knock. Confused, she went to the door and looked through the peephole, only to find that she couldn't see anyone there. But as she was looking, there was another knock, but it sounded low on the door. This house had an upstairs window that overlooked the front stoop, so she very carefully tiptoed up there, leaving the lights off, and looked down. And there was a strange man crouched down off to the side of the front door, waiting for her to open it. She said she called the police, but he took off before they could get there, probably thinking nobody was home. Before hearing this story, I had always wondered why my mom was so adamant about always checking to see who it was before you open the door. I was in Vegas with my brother. We both like to party hard, still in our 20s, walking down the strip. I see two guys with backpacks on. I know what that means. I say, "Damn, wish we had some weed." They immediately turn around and offer us other things as well. We took down his number to get other things later in the night. Hours later, after tons and tons of booze and stuff, we call this guy up for more. When we met these two guys, they were on foot. The second time, though, we had to meet them in front of a hotel because they were driving. So he tells us to hop in for a few so we can get what we need without people watching. Now at this point, my brother and I are fucked up and don't realize what's happening until it starts to get dark. We had only been driving for 10 minutes, but we were obviously off the strip, away from the lights, people, anything. This guy is driving like a goddamn maniac, with music blasting, so it was a bit distracting. My brother finally asks them where we're going. They say, "We're heading up to a liquor store real quick, and they'll drop us back off, but it seems like we're in the middle of nowhere." Finally realizing the situation we're in, we open the doors while we're at a stoplight and run to the only thing we see, a gas station. We flag down a cab that drove by a few minutes later. After we told him what happened, he calmly tells us, "There is no liquor store over here." It was the worst and best feeling ever. We narrowly escaped God knows what, and stayed silent for the rest of the night. When I was young enough to still be in a crib, my room and my parents' room were mirror images separated by a wall. When I got older, I moved upstairs, and the wall was knocked down to make a true master bedroom. My dress clothes were stored in the closet that had been my room. For some reason, every time I used to go in there looking for something, my heart would start racing, and I would get really scared for no reason and run out of there as quickly as I could. When I tried to think and figure out what made me feel this way, I would get this image of my head being in the dark, staring at the closet, and fire dancing around the room. One time, my mother noticed how anxious I was coming out of her room and asked me what was wrong. When I told her, the color ran from her face and she asked me, "You remember?" I didn't know what she was talking about, so she explained. While I was still in the crib, I used to wake my parents crying just about every night, telling them that there was a man in the closet and he wanted us to leave. After this had been going on for weeks and weeks, she started asking me questions about him. When she asked me who the man was, I told her, "Bill." That freaked her the fuck out. Before we moved in, the house had belonged to her great uncle Bill. When he was elderly, he had a live-in assistant, who it turns out was actually a burglar who was robbing the houses in the neighborhood. I guess Bill started to figure it out, because eventually the guy tied him to the bed, robbed the house, and set the house on fire before running out. He eventually got caught, but Bill burned to death. After learning the name, my mom said she basically said out loud, "Uncle Bill, it's me. We live here now. This is my son, and you're scaring him. We're going to take good care of your house, so please leave us be." After that, I slept through the night with no problem, and that was the last we heard of the man in the closet. The real estate market can be brutal, whether you're the buyer, the seller, or the agent. The highs and lows of purchasing a home can be extremely stressful. But what if it also involved the death of others? Had a dark past that you had to decide to live with or pass on? Here are 10 stories on what some people had to endure in this process. Enjoy. The lady next door to me died and wasn't found until she was more liquid than solid on her living room carpet. The family couldn't pay something about back taxes or something, and the house went to HUD to auction. HUD paid for some cleanup, but not to replace the carpet, only steam clean it. It finally sold, and I was talking to the guy who was flipping it. Before I could mention the death, he asked if the house had had a water leak under the foundation because they had ripped up the carpet and pad to put down the lament floor. It was really dirty and got all over them and their clothes. I told him what happened and how HUD went cheap on what to fix before the auction. He got green and started puking right there on his side of the fence. My parents were realtors and also flipped houses. When I was growing up, I used to help them a lot, usually by cleaning. When I was 12, I was helping with a house that was infested with roaches. I noticed the closets were smeared with shit and children's handprints. There were fingernail scratches on the insides of the doors as well. I asked my parents why this was the case. They told me the old tenants used to lock their toddlers in the closets for days. When I was looking for my last house, I went with my wife and a realtor to look at several houses. We went to look at one house in particular because it didn't seem like the price they were asking for could be real. Huge house, sitting on tons of land with outbuildings, going for millions under market value. We got there, and the realtor said, "Oh, I should mention, a serial killer lived here, and when he was put away, cops found 11 bodies on the property." I'm not a realtor, but I suppose the story is relevant. My extended family used to live in a really old house located just north of London. Previously, it used to be Queen Victoria's stop when she was traveling in the area. My uncle, when younger, never believed in ghosts or spirits and would be the first one to call it a load of rubbish. He was sleeping one night and was awoken by a man staring at him at the end of his bed, dressed in an old army uniform. My uncle froze for a few seconds, panicked, and flicked the bedside lamp on, and the man vanished. He refused to sleep in that room from that night onward. We later found out that the man was a previous owner who had returned from war to find his wife having an affair. He was so furious that his wife reported to have told her he would do the worst thing possible to get back at her. He took his twin sons, toddlers at the time, went to the back of the garden where there was a forest, shot them both dead before killing himself. The funny thing is that since my family bought the property, my uncle had twin sons. My mother had twin sons. My uncle's brother, who was also part owner of the property, had twin sons. The weirder part is that my brothers and my uncle and aunt's kids were playing near the forest, and when they were in there, they kept on saying they heard boys laughing, but couldn't see anybody there. They didn't know the house's history. This involves a couple who bought a house in the 1980s. They called me a couple years ago wanting to sell. As we're talking, the wife starts telling me about her difficult pregnancies and how she'd been pregnant many times but lost them all. I felt bad for her, but I'm wondering what this has to do with anything. The husband pipes up and says, "After the last one, I didn't know what to do. I came home, and the first thing I thought to do was remodel the kitchen. I had to break something." He goes on about his impromptu kitchen demolition, dishes still in the cabinets and everything. The guy was devastated that they lost another baby. So he says he's ripping out a corner, and he said he always knew there was a dead pocket there because the span was 3 feet, but the closet behind it was only 2 feet deep. He proceeds to rip out the drywall and finds a ball of cloth. As he pulls back the layers, he realizes it's the skeleton of a baby. It was wrapped up with a teddy bear. He called the police and said they'd never gotten any follow-up on it. My dad moved into a house where we later learned the previous owner's son killed himself. There was nothing saying as to whether he lived in the house, but we do know which bedroom was his. I'm not into paranormal nonsense, but my sister had that room. Before we learned about the son killing himself, she had all sorts of weird things happening in the room. Alarms going off at odd hours of the night. The TV just turns on, shuts off whenever it feels like it. Especially weird when it's at night and you're all alone. I don't like going up there for that reason. The previous owner also came home one day to catch his wife cheating on him and started shooting at them. He missed them and you can still see the bullet marks on the wall of the master bedroom. I have had several experiences involving real estate nightmares. One happened when I was managing an apartment complex and walked in on a guy who was in bed decomposing for 2 weeks over the worst heat wave in years. His head was partially melted into the pillow, and his back was full of maggots. I had a couple of stiff drinks that night. Another incident occurred when I walked through a house where a hoarder lived and was attacked by fleas. Saw a rat in the master bedroom the size of a football. Noticed droppings on the bed too. Lady had been living there her entire life and never threw anything away. Apparently, couldn't get rid of the rat either. Property inspection turned up a dead body in the attic. It was a suicide. Someone had hung themselves. The homeowner thought her husband had left her years ago. In a way, I guess he did. I used to rent an apartment that was in a converted asylum. It was rumored to be haunted, but I never heard or saw anything whilst living there. When I met with the letting agent to hand the keys back at the property and for him to run through a final inspection, he asked if we had been happy there. I said something to the effect of yes, but we were only moving as the landlord had it up for sale. It became clear he was after some kind of ghost story, as he explained that none of his colleagues liked going to any apartments in the building because when taking photos to market one of them, the red eye detector kept triggering on his phone when no one was in frame. The poor guy looked nervous as hell the entire time we were there. About 6 months ago, I was looking into homes in the area I grew up in because I'm planning to move back to the area. I found a pretty cute house on a busy street in town, read all the info, and it seemed like a good option for my fiance and I. Then something hit me. Based on the address and info provided, I realized it had to be the same house where a Chinese family of 4 was brutally murdered 2 years ago, and the police still don't know who did it. Well, what about you? Are you looking to buy? Have you had something like this happen to you? Have you had a terrifying experience that you would like to share here? If so, contact me through any of my social media links or email me at DuchessDark676@gmail.com. See you next time.